welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic, where we try to make sense of the pretzel logic and circus-like chicanery inside and outside of the Washington blob. Today, I have two special guests to talk about a real unfolding foreign policy failure happening right before our eyes. According to the most recent reports, the Biden administration is closer than ever to signing a deal with Saudi Arabia that they think will eventually lead to Saudi-Israeli normalization, a la the Abraham Accords that were first set into motion by the Trump administration during his term. The deal reportedly on the table today would give the Saudis a security agreement and that the U.S. would be obligated to defend Riyadh militarily if it were attacked. The U.S. would also agree to help the Saudis get a nuclear power program off the ground, ostensibly for civilian use. In exchange, the Saudis will think about normalizing with Israelis down the road, and then maybe, just maybe, this will lead to a two-state solution for Israel Palestine. But those are a lot of maybes. The Israelis, however, don't seem very interested in the normalization. Maybe they're interested in the normalization, but not the two-state solution. So it might be that Washington just gives all these things away to Saudi Arabia, a dictatorship that we know now has ties to the 9/11 hijackers and the killing and dismembership of Saudi American journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018 with little in exchange. So I got a lot of questions from my guests here today. So please let me introduce them first. Sarah Leah Whitson is an American lawyer and the executive director of Democracy for the Arab World Now, otherwise known as DAWN. She previously served as director of the Middle East and North Africa Division of Human Rights Watch. And Danny Davis is a retired Army officer who served in the First Persian Gulf War as well as the Afghanistan War. He is a senior fellow at Defense Priorities and the host of the podcast Deep Dive. Thanks to you both for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Definitely my pleasure.
So, Sarah Leah, I'd like to start with you. Can you and correct me if any of my setup was wrong in terms of where the current reporting is on this deal? And can you talk a little bit about why the Biden administration is so hell bent on getting this deal with Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, sure. So the Biden administration shared one central pillar of strategy with the Trump administration. And that has been to make the Abraham Accords a central pillar of its approach to the Middle East, securing normalization for Israel from Arab regimes, from Arab dictatorships, with the United States paying the bill for these normalization agreements with the various dictatorships that have agreed to normalize. So, for example, the UAE was able to purchase the most advanced fighter jets that previously was unable to purchase. Morocco obtained U.S. recognition of its occupation of Western Sahara, its annexation of Western Sahara. The U.S. recognized sovereignty over Western Sahara, and a variety of other goodies and perks to the transitional dictatorship in Sudan and Bahrain and so forth. So the real prize for the Biden administration was securing Saudi normalization, Saudi recognition of Israel, in exchange for what Saudi wanted, again, U.S. paying the bill. And that was, number one, a defense treaty. Number two, a nuclear plant, a civilian nuclear plant. There were other numbers attached to that, which they already got. Number three was granting immunity to Mohammed bin Salman from the lawsuits he was facing in the United States for the murder of Khashoggi, but also for other attempted murders and acts of harassment and intimidation against journalists. So he's now immune from prosecution thanks to the Biden administration. The genius of the Abraham Accords was that Israel was getting all of these goodies, normalization, recognition from Arab dictatorships without giving anything in return. And that was the way in which Netanyahu advertised this. We are only exchanging peace for peace. We are not exchanging peace for territory. We're not exchanging peace for Palestinian statehood. So from the Israeli perspective, from Netanyahu's perspective, this deal was always about doing nothing but getting normalization with Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia has backed away from that original conception, saying, no, 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 we can't possibly normalize with you under the current circumstances of this plausibly genocidal atrocities in Gaza, etc. We need a credible, time-bound path to statehood. And now, of course, Netanyahu and Israel are saying, no way.
Hmm.
For that reason, and I'm sorry if I'm going on too long.
No, this is great.
For that reason, the Biden administration has now broken what was supposed to be one package deal of telling American officials that the reason we're giving Saudi Arabia a defense pact, a defense agreement, and a nuclear plant is so that they will normalize with Israel, which, for everybody has to accept is in the interests of the United States. Now that Israel is refusing, as I've always said, the number one reason this deal won't happen is because the Israeli government is so nuts, because they absolutely refuse to make any concessions in exchange for normalization. They don't want anything to do with it. So the Biden administration is now dividing it into two things: separate track for Saudi normalization with Israel in exchange for a pathway to statehood, which is a pathway to nowhere. And separately, a U.S. defense pact and nuclear plant in exchange for what the United States actually is getting in exchange for a defense pact with Saudi Arabia. And that is continued weapon sales, continued control and access to the Saudi skies, continued military hegemony in Saudi Arabia, and the ultimate sort of goal of ensuring that China and Russia, but in particular China, don't move forward economically in terms of their relationship with Saudi Arabia. The first person who talked about building a nuclear plant publicly and openly in Saudi Arabia was Xi Jinping, and during a visit to Riyadh with Mohammed bin Salman. So they are now effectively, the US is now competing with China to build this nuclear plant in exchange for putting American men and women's lives on the line to defend the Saudi dictatorship. I could go on and on, but let me pause here since there's endless curly cues to this.
There's many curly cues. Well, let's talk about that last part. And Dan, I want you to comment on this specifically. I mean, at the end of the day, this is about putting American men and women's lives on the line for Saudi Arabia. How do you react to that?
Well, the first thing that just jumps right off the page to me is why? What other than the legit things that Sarah Leah there just pointed out that the U.S. would, gain, if you want to use those terms, access to the skies, unencumbered access into the area, et cetera. What does that do for me? Why do I need to pay for that? As exorbitant as we have here, and especially when you're talking that price tag comes with tying my security to Saudi Arabia's security and putting us on the line so that if they get into a fight with Iran or whatever, I guess it's probably the only legitimate possibility that, at least at the moment, that it could happen. Why do we need to get into a fight with them? Because look, I mean, I think it doesn't take much of a stretch to think, okay, if Saudi ever thought they wanted to have any kind of a fight with Iran, or maybe in the future things could change even with Iraq, who knows, they would be a lot more inclined to take some risk if they knew they had Uncle Sugar over on their back. Yeah. Whereas if they don't, then they'll say, all right, we have to operate in this neighborhood that we live, and we have, limitations, and we just have to make deals like they have for centuries before, and like they should be able to do now. The only reason we should ever get into a mutual security deal is if our security is enhanced in the process. If the American people will be safer because we'll have the Saudi military over our back if we ever get into a pinch, then that would be an area where we could start talking. And of course, that's farcical because all of their military power comes based on what we provide. So that's never going to happen, that they're going to come to our military aid. So there's no value to us in this at all. To me, is whatever alleged benefits might accrue to this. I think that the weights that come along with it and the detractions and the negatives and the potential negatives in the future overwhelmingly say this is a bad deal. It's not in America's interest. It's not even necessary for us to promote our interests. We don't have one now. We don't have a security issue with Saudi Arabia now. We don't need one. We've got all kinds of other bilateral agreements that have been able to operate and give us whatever access we need. So tell me, what would we gain then that we don't already have now at a lot lower price?
Well, the interesting thing is that during the Trump administration, he kind of clawed back some of the security, I guess, guarantees to Saudi Arabia. And they were quite surprised when he didn't spring into action after they were attacked ostensibly by Iran. I believe it was their oil fields.
Yeah.
And
The
I don't know
Aramco
what year
field
that
was
was.
it, right?
And so it seems as, and there was tons of talk about us sort of retrenching from the region and starting to allow the Middle Eastern country to start handling their own security. And it seems to just sort of be dialing it all the way back to even pre-Trump times. Do you think, well, let me ask Sarah Leah, what you're hearing on the ground there, how close are they to this agreement? Because I've been seeing sort of mixed messages in the media where a couple weeks ago, I think it was Jake Sullivan was in Saudi Arabia. They were talking about this something like coming in days, but then you had this, as you mentioned, the Israeli factor here and the splitting up. How close are they to even announcing something like this? And what kind of resistance do you think there will be on Capitol Hill, either by Republicans or Democrats, to such a proposal?
Well, if you strip away the Israel normalization element from this deal, which was the main selling point of the Biden administration to Congress as to why we were going to enter into a defense treaty with Saudi Arabia, I think it will be a lot less popular in Congress, and they might actually do their job a little bit, which is to question what interests this serves of the United States. Unfortunately, it makes it a lot more transparent that the Biden administration is basically using Americans as American forces, as mercenary forces, to pursue and serve the economic interests of defense companies, who, of course, are important donors to the Biden administration, with which the Biden administration, from the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, have very deep ties and likely future employment opportunities, as well as, of course, hoping that Saudi Arabia will be persuaded to therefore keep the price of oil down. So cheap and dirty fossil fuels. We have the Biden administration talking and talking and talking, not only about pivoting away from the Middle East, withdrawing from the Middle East to focus on Asia and so forth. And none of that's happening, but there's commitment to climate and reducing emissions. All of that goes out the window when it's about the price of oil before an election. So these things become more transparent in terms of the Biden administration's short-term, selfish calculations to secure a defense treaty with Saudi Arabia. That doesn't really serve certainly the long-term interests of the American people, the security interests of the American people, but very, very handsomely serves the donor class and the corporate defense industries that will benefit handsomely from this. I mean, with respect to the nuclear plant, it will also, again, be extremely lucrative for the American companies that are able to build a uranium enrichment plant in Saudi Arabia. I think the only fight there now is whether the U.S. will enrich the uranium itself in a black box or offshore and import it the way the UAE does, or as what Mohammed bin Salman wants, is Saudi capacity to learn how to enrich its own uranium. But nobody in the Biden administration talks about or takes into account or balances the costs to our country, to our security interests, with a country that we have seen acts irrationally, impulsively, recklessly, and dangerously, not just in murdering Jamal Khashoggi, who was actually the founder of Dawn, but in this ongoing war in Yemen, which still has not been resolved, that has killed over 300,000 people, with pilots, by the way, Saudi pilots, who were such terrible pilots and such cowardly pilots that they would drop their bombs from such a high altitude because they're so terrified of getting shot down that their bombing was even more indiscriminate than it otherwise would have been. And of course, the threatened war against Qatar not too long ago. I mean, Saudi Arabia was threatening to roll its tanks into Qatar. So the notion that they would now do all of these belligerent actions in the region, a lot of that sort of guerrilla chest thumping that Mohammed bin Salman seems to love, with the US backing, is only going to make it more likely that we're going to get further entangled in another one of his reckless military shenanigans.
Danny, what about the US military? How did they accept this type of proposal? I would imagine on one hand, US CENTCOM loves the mission. They want to be in the Middle East. They probably are concerned about retrenchment. This, gets them full square back into the game. The weapons are being sold. They have to be maintained. These Saudis have to be trained on them. So I would imagine there'll be support for the military for such a guarantee. But what about rank and file? Like, what about the idea that U.S. women and men be put in harm's way for Saudi Arabia? I don't think Saudi Arabia is very popular with Americans on a whole. They know that they had something to do with 9/11 and the hijackers. We have evidence pouring in all the time, drip, 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 about the official connections between Saudi Arabia and the 9/11 hijackers. What's going on there in terms of like how the military perceives this?
Yeah, well, yeah. What's not like about that? A couple of things I want to point out. First of all, kind of at the 30,000-foot level, almost all of these conversations happen with an assumption that's being made on multiple sides of this within the United States, which I think needs to be stopped, and stop talking about an assumption and shine a couple of spotlights on it and try to examine this to see whether it's valid or not. I think you know where I'm going with this. And that is that the assumption is that the U.S. military has to be in the Middle East for things to work, whether that's in Jordan, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, all over the place, all these places, Kuwait. We have to be there or everything's going to fall apart. Like the world is just going to cease to exist. The Middle East is just going to turn into a cauldron of fire, like it's not already in a really great space. But the view is that all of the conversations have to start with how many Americans should be where, not whether they should be there. And I argue that day has long since passed. And you saw this rear its ugly head during the Trump administration when after so Obama sends troops into Iraq and in Syria to fight ISIS before he leaves. Trump inherits them. They have the so-called caliphate, especially in Raqqa and Mosul. And so he gives the military, that Trump does, the order to eradicate those holdings, and he does that. And the military, he gives them a military attainable mission. They accomplish the mission with the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Iraqi security forces. In both those cases, they get rid of them. They're gone. Mission accomplished. At that point, Trump should have withdrawn the troops and brought them back home. And you may recall 2 big times he tried to do that. He said, yep, we're going to withdraw them and bring them home. Mission accomplished. Why not? But there was this humongous backlash and resistance against even the thought of withdrawing any of those troops. And Trump allowed himself to be talked out of it in both cases. And then he ends up actually embracing it. I don't know what was happened behind the scenes, but he went from ordering it out twice to embracing it, that we're going to keep the oil and all kinds of nonsense like that, which is, illegal and by any stretch. And now we are still there today doing nothing. And we've now had 3 troops killed in Jordan as part of that mission because we didn't withdraw them before. and we keep getting attacked, all kinds of stuff, then, that should be your casus belli to say, hey, why are we still there? Why don't we leave? But because of this ingrained idea that we have to be there, no one's even willing to talk about that. But when you're talking about security agreements and whatever, you would probably have to put more troops in there to make good on any of these things that happen, to be able to have a credible offensive operation should one be needed in the event of a security arrangement. But where's the Saudi guys coming to the U.S. side, for example? Again, mutual security. That's what is on paper, but there's no mutual to it. There's not even the pretense of it. It's just us providing security for Saudi Arabia or whoever else out there, Baghdad, the SDF in Syria, et cetera. And at what point, Kelly, did we finally say the U.S. military is for the U.S.? We signed up. I signed up when I was on, not to defend Baghdad, not to defend the Syrian Democratic Forces or half a dozen countries in Africa. I just signed up to defend our country. And right now, that's not even part of the calculation. I think that until we get that part undone, all the rest of this stuff can take care of itself, because I will argue emphatically, historically, over centuries of time, and even over the last 100 or so years, when we don't have troops on the ground in the Middle East, it takes care of itself. It's chaotic. There's coups. There's all kinds of stuff. There's violence, as it has been for the last 1,500 years. And it will be the next 1,500 years if time continues on that long without our troops. It won't make any difference. But we keep ourselves safe no matter what happens over there. Why then should we tie ourselves to somebody else's security for their benefit at our cost?
Yeah. And as Sarah Leah mentioned, there's great power politics going on. We don't want China to get a footing into the Middle East, which they are. They're doing their own thing. I mean, they're making all sorts of gains through trade and economics, and we don't like that, because our language has been all in security for the last 20 years, while China's doing its thing on the economic front and kind of moving in, and we don't like it. And so we're going to end up entrenching our military back into the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, because we don't like the moves that.
And by the way, Kelly, I wanted to add one more thing there in your question about the military and what they want. I showed a clip on my show a week or two ago of David Petraeus, who was arguing that, he goes, I was never one of those who wanted to get rid of the forever wars. We should never have left Afghanistan. We should still be there today. We should stay in Syria forever. And at least it's naked and open. But I mean, that's got to cause people to say, wait, so we'll never be finished with wars? But it didn't give a ripple. People just go, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know we don't have a ton of time, so I want to just go back to the normalization aspect of this, which we all acknowledge has kind of fallen off the wayside. But I think it might be good to talk about where this all came from and how it's led to the current conflict in Gaza. And I don't think that that's talked about in the mainstream media enough. Sarah Leah, can you talk a little bit about the existing normalization agreements with Israel and why that might have set off a tripwire to the Hamas attacks on October 7th? We can't say that that's all that caused the attacks on October 7th, but in terms of the dynamics that emanated from those agreements and why pushing forward on more of them would be counterproductive for the region.
Yeah. So the Abraham Accords were premised on the notion that Israel could secure so-called normalization or acceptance in the Middle East among Arab governments without having to resolve the Palestinian question. The conventional wisdom pumped out into mainstream Washington via Israeli propaganda supported by UAE propaganda was that the Palestinian issue was dead. Nobody cares about the Palestinians anymore. Things are calm. We can kick this can down the road in perpetuity of permanent, perpetual, managed occupation. And when the UAE normalized with Israel, breaking away from the Arab Peace Initiative, which offered normalization with Israel in exchange for the creation of two states, it made the Arab Peace Initiative was dead, and that Arab governments were willing to kiss and make up with Israel and recognize it without addressing the Palestinian issue. And so the idea was that Israel could be made stronger without resolving the Palestinian issue by securing these agreements with dictatorships. It reflected an absolute abandonment, the UAE, Morocco, Sudan, Bahrain, of the Palestinian issue by these unelected dictators to say, we choose Israel in exchange for the goodies that America is giving us. The notion that that would be a basis for security without addressing the military occupation of Palestinians approaching 60 years now, on top of the apartheid rule against Palestinians from the river to the sea, was something that many of us were saying was completely fantastic. You cannot rule over people militarily without expecting there to be an explosion of some kind, a human explosion. You cannot expect to oppress and suppress people, to keep Gaza under siege since 2006, so that the vast majority of the 2.3 million people in Gaza have never been outside that territory because Israel keeps them trapped in this massive cage. That is not sustainable or manageable. And what October 7 showed was the truth of that, was that the Palestinians would not just accept being ignored and erased from the international conversation. And the attack and the shocking response of the Israelis that is still underway, 1,000 eyes for an eye approach, has obviously completely upended the false assumptions on which the Abraham Accords were based. If Israel wants to be normal, if it wants to act like a normal country, then it needs to end its abnormal crimes of an illegal military occupation, illegal apartheid rule, and now we can add plausibly genocidal atrocities.
Well, Dan, when you hear Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and Biden and company saying that somehow a normalization agreement brokered with Saudi Arabia and Israel will somehow lead to a two-state solution, maybe sometime down the road, and in essence, peace. I mean, what do you take from that? Do you think that the American people and globally that anybody's taking that seriously? And is it just a lack of imagination on the part of the Biden administration to think that they can convince maybe themselves that such an agreement would actually fix the long-standing entrenched conflict going on there with Israel and Palestine by just brokering an agreement with Saudi Arabia?
If we were conducting genuine diplomacy, and that means like with all the parties in the region, and we wanted normalization and a two-state solution as a means to bring stability. I'll never use the word peace because I think there's too many violent strands running through there, but you can bring stability to the region that has a shot at long lasting. And it included all of those things. It would be really, really hard to do, but at least theoretically possible. But if you go in there with the assumption that your primary partner, the Israelis, are telling you point blank that's never going to happen with a two-state solution, no matter what you say with your mouth all day long, then you basically guaranteed and baked in failure. It'll never bring any kind of stability or peace to anybody. It'll just bring political cover for your favored nation. And that's what it's going to do. And there's definitely a path to where Saudi Arabia could go, yeah, I'll take some of that too. And so you'll have two good things for those two regimes, and then just continued poverty for the people, as Sarah Lee had just very clearly stated, and accurately so. perpetuity that they'll stay in that prison, and the people aren't going to stay there. That's why I say that militarily, for this war right here, all this stuff aside, Israel is pursuing a policy that cannot and will not succeed for its people. They're not going to bring any peace, because they're even exacerbating further the underlying causes of what led to the explosion on October 7th, now far worse going forward than they ever had prior to that, because of the wanton destruction and killing of so many innocent people. But until we decide, first of all, that we're going to have an actual negotiation where that means there's give and take among all the parties, that Israel is not going to get to just write its blank check and tell us what we're going to do, then they're going to be guaranteed failure. And the only way we change that dynamic is if we do genuine diplomacy and tell Israel, you're not going to get everything you want to. And if you want to get these other things, you're going to have to make some changes over here.
Yeah.
Or be willing to say, and if you don't, you're on your own. Good luck to you, but we'll never do that.
One last question, Sarah Leah. I know you've laid out what the political dynamics are or could be for this Saudi-U.S. agreement in Congress. Is the Biden administration setting this out as a treaty in which they would have to get Senate approval, first of all, and second, are they trying to ram this through before the election for any electoral or political gain, rather than see the Trump administration rush in, if there is a new Trump administration, rush in and do it itself and take the glory? Like, can you talk a little bit about that before we go?
Yeah, I mean, the electoral gain strategy and the urge to get this done before potentially a Republican administration gets in, I think was premised by the Biden administration that pro-Israel donors would keep their support for Biden if he delivered something this valuable for Israel. And I think that was one of the main drivers in terms of making this a treaty, which would obtain congressional approval. Again, the idea was, if we secure this for Israel, then Congress will bless it.
Yeah.
Now, both these pieces are gone, and the only piece that's left is profits for the defense industry, cheap oil, and U.S. military hegemony over Saudi Arabia, ignoring all the risks and costs that we described. I don't know, to be honest, if that's sufficient for our Congress to approve this deal. I think there's a lot more interest by the Republicans to tank the deal, because why should they? It's not like Israel's going to be mad at them. It's not like the pro-Israel community is going to be mad at them or punish them, since it's not part of the deal. And they can secure the deal if there's a Trump administration under Trump, and he can get the bravos and the cheers and the support from the interest groups that benefit.
Yeah.
They have talked about doing a 4.5 Article 4.5 treaty, which is less than a treaty guarantee, wouldn't need congressional approval, similar to the security agreement they reached with Bahrain last year. But the problem is the Saudis want it treaty level so that they can never have someone like Biden come in and say, we're done, we're finished with you, we're not going to sell you weapons, ... So, for the Saudis, it is a real kind of bringing Biden to his knees, not only making him eat his words and kiss the ring, but, prostrating himself, humiliating himself to now be the defense guarantor of Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. It's pretty embarrassing, actually, considering everything that they've done. And you've done tremendous work on outlining through the years the murders, the assassinations, the wars, and to top it all off, 9/11. And then we're going to turn around and give them this sort of war obligation, is basically what it is. Thank you both for coming on. We'll keep an eye on this, and I hope to have you both back to talk about this and other things relating to our conflicts in the Middle East.